We're told that 19th century institutional architecture evolved organically, each region adapting designs to local needs, climates, and materials. But between 1820 and 1870, nearly identical asylum floor plans appeared in Philadelphia, London, Manchester, Boston, Edinburgh, and New York. Same radial wings. Same central administrative cores. Same ventilation shafts. Same corridor widths. Some built within months of each other, separated by an ocean. The buildings didn't just share ideas. They shared measurements. And they appeared in cities that hadn't yet developed the conditions those buildings were designed to manage. This is an investigative documentary. It examines architectural patterns, historical records, and institutional timelines. It does not claim hidden truths or suppressed knowledge. It presents observations, invites questions, and acknowledges that multiple interpretations exist for the evidence discussed. The standard explanation is reasonable. Reformers and architects of the early 19th century embraced a moral treatment movement that standardized institutional design. Books, journals, and international medical conferences spread these ideas rapidly. Efficiency and humanism converged into blueprint consensus. That's the story in every architectural history textbook. But the timeline compresses in unusual ways. In 1813, the York Retreat in England introduced a new model for asylum care. Smaller wards, natural light, classified patients, and radial layouts that allowed observation without confinement. By 1817, near-identical designs appeared in Massachusetts. By 1821 in Philadelphia. By 1824 in Scotland. By 1828 in upstate New York. Not inspired by versions. Not regional adaptations. Structural twins. The same number of wings. The same proportions. The same relationship between administrative centers and patient corridors. The same fenestration rhythms. Some of these buildings were under construction simultaneously. The Kirkbride Plan, formalized in 1854 by Dr. Thomas Story Kirkbride, is often credited as the origin point. But Kirkbride didn't invent the design. He codified something already in widespread use. The buildings predated the manual. Take the Pennsylvania Hospital for the Insane, completed in 1841. It had the radial layout, the classification wings, the ventilation towers, the symmetrical massing, all features later described in Kirkbride's published guidelines. The Eastern State Penitentiary in Philadelphia, opened in 1829, used the same radial logic. 7 corridors radiating from a central surveillance hub. A panopticon structure that prison reformers would later claim as revolutionary. But that design had already appeared in asylums across England and Scotland. And it would reappear almost identically in almshouses, hospitals, and workhouses across North America and the British Isles over the next 40 years. The architectural drawings survive. They're accessible in municipal archives, medical society libraries, and historical collections. When you compare them side by side, the similarities aren't philosophical. They're dimensional. Corridor widths, 10 to 12 feet. Wing lengths, 120 to 150 feet. Central tower heights, 60 to 80 feet. Distance between patient rooms, 12 to 14 feet. These weren't guidelines. They were specifications. And the buildings were enormous. The Utica State Lunatic Asylum in New York, opened in 1843, was designed to hold 600 patients. At the time of its opening, the entire county had fewer than 400 documented cases of mental illness. The Trans-Allegheny Lunatic Asylum in West Virginia, completed in 1881, was built to house 250 patients. It had capacity for 2,400. These weren't overcrowded from the start. They were empty. In England, the County Asylums Act of 1808 required each county to build an asylum. By 1820, dozens were under construction. Many used the same template: radial wings, central observation, gender-separated corridors, and airing courts. Most were 3 to 5 times larger than the population they were meant to serve. The explanation given at the time: future-proofing. Planners anticipated population growth and rising rates of diagnosis. But the rate of construction didn't align with population trends. The buildings appeared in rural counties with stable populations. They appeared in industrial cities still decades away from peak density. They appeared in regions that wouldn't require that capacity for another 50 years. And yet the infrastructure was already in place. There's another detail embedded in the architecture itself. These asylums weren't just large, they were sophisticated. Gas lighting systems, central heating with steam radiators, gravity-fed water distribution, fireproofing with cast iron columns, acoustic isolation in ward design. All of this in the 1830s and 1840s, when most urban housing still relied on open fires, oil lamps, and outdoor wells. The institutional buildings had infrastructure that residential neighborhoods wouldn't receive for another generation. The layout itself encoded a philosophy of observation and control that wouldn't be formally theorized until later. Michel Foucault's concept of the panopticon, a design where observers see without being seen, wasn't published until 1975. But the architecture already expressed it. Radial arms allowed a single observer at the center to monitor all corridors. Patients could be seen at all times. Staff remained unseen. The geometry enforced asymmetry of visibility. This wasn't accidental. It was embedded in the floor plan. And it wasn't limited to asylums. The same radial template appeared in prisons, workhouses, orphanages, almshouses, quarantine hospitals. Different institutions, different populations, same architectural DNA. Why would the same design serve such different functions? One answer: efficiency. A single template could be adapted to multiple uses, reducing costs and construction time. But these buildings weren't cheap. They were monumental. Stone facades, ornamental ironwork, hand-carved lintels, multi-story atriums. If efficiency was the goal, the design would have been simpler. There's something else. The term Tartarian architecture wasn't used in the 19th century. It emerged later in online communities examining architectural and infrastructural patterns that seemed disconnected from the societies that supposedly built them. But the institutional buildings of this period, asylums, prisons, hospitals, occupy a specific place in that discussion. Not because they're definitively linked to any single origin, but because the uniformity, the timing, and the scale. The pattern becomes more difficult to ignore when you look at what was happening across the Atlantic at exactly the same time. Between 1817 and 1825, New York State began construction on the Erie Canal, a 363-mile waterway connecting the Great Lakes to the Atlantic Ocean. It required 83 locks, 18 aqueducts, and the removal of millions of cubic yards of earth and rock. The state's population at the time was roughly 1.4 million. The canal was designed to move commercial freight that didn't yet exist, between cities that hadn't yet been built, for an agricultural and industrial output the region hadn't yet produced. And it was completed in 8 years. At the same time those asylums were going up with identical floor plans, the infrastructure to support them, and the cities around them, was being laid at a scale that preceded the demand. Gas works, water mains, sewer systems, rail lines, all appearing in the same narrow window of time. In Philadelphia, the Fairmount Water Works opened in 1815. It used steam-powered pumps to deliver clean water to the entire city through a grid of underground mains, something that wouldn't become standard in European capitals for another 30 years. By 1820, Philadelphia had pressurized indoor plumbing in public buildings. Most of London still relied on communal pumps. The timing here matters. Because while these grand institutional buildings were being erected with radial perfection and advanced mechanical systems, much of the urban housing stock was still pre-industrial. Wooden structures, no indoor plumbing, outhouses, coal or wood heat. The infrastructure wasn't evenly distributed. It appeared first in institutions, then in municipal systems, then, sometimes decades later, in homes. The same pattern emerges in Britain. During the 1830s and 1840s, a wave of railway construction swept across England, Scotland, and Wales. Tens of thousands of miles of track were laid. Viaducts, tunnel stations, bridges. Much of this was built before passenger demand existed. The Stockton and Darlington Railway, opened in 1825, was designed primarily for coal transport. But the infrastructure it required, graded routes, engineered bridges, standardized track gauge, was the same infrastructure later used for passenger service. It was as if the system was built in anticipation of a need that hadn't yet been articulated. And then there's the administrative coordination. These projects, canals, asylums, rail networks, water systems, were theoretically independent. Different funding sources, different municipal or state authorities, different contractors. But the designs share a vocabulary. The same engineering principles. The same material choices. The same construction techniques. Take the use of cast iron. By the 1830s, cast iron columns and beams were appearing in institutional buildings across the US and UK. Not experimentally, systematically. Asylums in Massachusetts had cast iron framing. Prisons in Pennsylvania had cast iron cell fronts. Hospitals in London had cast iron staircases. Workhouses in Manchester had cast iron window frames. All within the same 15-year period. Cast iron allowed for fireproofing, taller structures, and open interior spaces. It was advanced construction technology, but it required industrial production capacity, foundries, molds, transportation networks to move heavy materials. That capacity existed, and it was being used simultaneously on a continent-wide scale for institutional construction. The same coordination appears in the asylum networks themselves. By 1850, nearly every U.S. state had at least one large public asylum. Most had 2 or 3. They weren't built incrementally as populations grew and diagnoses increased. They were built in waves. 1830 to 1835. First wave across New England and the Mid-Atlantic. 1840 to 1848. Second wave into the Midwest and Upper South. 1850 to 1860. Third wave into the newly settled Western territories. These buildings often opened before the regions they served had the administrative infrastructure to manage them. Record systems, patient transfer protocols, staff training programs, legal frameworks for involuntary commitment. Those came later. The buildings came first. The same thing happened with the rail networks. Tracks were laid into territories that were still largely undeveloped. Stations were built in towns with populations under 500. Freight depots were constructed in regions where commercial agriculture hadn't yet begun. The Illinois Central Railroad, chartered in 1851, laid over 700 miles of track through central Illinois, much of it through empty prairie. The railroad preceded settlement. It didn't follow demand. It created the conditions for demand. And the asylums? They created the conditions for diagnosis. Before the large institutions existed, mental illness was managed at home, in almshouses, or in small private facilities. There was no centralized system, no standardized classification, no formal distinction between conditions. The buildings introduced the categories. Once the infrastructure existed, the population expanded to fill it. By 1860, many of those oversized asylums were at capacity. The architecture itself may have influenced who was diagnosed and how. The radial design enforced separation. Patients were classified by type: acute, chronic, violent, melancholic. Each category had its own wing. But those categories weren't medical, they were architectural. The building's layout determined the taxonomy of illness. In England, the same process unfolded. The County Asylums Act required institutions, but it didn't specify design. Yet the buildings that emerged, from Devon to Northumberland, shared the same structural logic. Radial, symmetrical, monumental. Some were designed by the same architects. Many were not. But the pattern held. There's a phrase that appears in some of the historical discussions around these buildings, particularly among those examining the infrastructure of the period through a less conventional lens. Tartarian institutional architecture. It's not a term from the 19th century. It's a modern interpretive label, used to describe a perceived continuity in institutional design that seems to transcend regional variation and exceed the stated needs of the populations it served. The label itself is contested, but the pattern it attempts to describe is observable. Whether this reflects inherited infrastructure, coordinated planning, or parallel development driven by shared economic and political pressures, those are questions that remain open. But the buildings themselves don't require interpretation to be seen. They're still standing. Many are still in use. And their floor plans, their scale, their simultaneity across regions separated by thousands of miles. The word Tartaria appears on European maps from the 16th through 19th centuries. It wasn't a nation. It was a geographic label, a catch-all term for the vast territories of Central Asia that European cartographers hadn't fully surveyed. By the mid-1800s, as those regions were explored and colonized, the term faded from official use. But in recent years, it has re-emerged, not as geography but as interpretation. Online communities examining architectural and infrastructural history began using Tartaria as shorthand for a pattern they observed. Monumental buildings, advanced systems, and synchronized construction timelines that seemed misaligned with the official narratives of organic development. The term is polarizing. Some dismiss it entirely. Others use it to explore questions about inheritance, reuse, and the possibility that certain infrastructure predated the societies credited with building it. This documentary doesn't endorse a single interpretation. It presents the evidence and allows for multiple frameworks. There are, broadly, 3 ways to interpret the institutional architecture of the early 19th century. The first, standard historical consensus. Industrialization, reform movements, and international knowledge exchange produced rapid, coordinated development. Architects shared ideas through published works and professional networks. Similar problems led to similar solutions. The scale reflected ambition and future planning. This explanation accounts for most of the evidence. It doesn't require speculation. The second, adaptive reuse. Some researchers propose that certain large institutional buildings were not entirely new construction, but expansions or modifications of earlier structures. Foundations, basements, or core frameworks may have predated the 19th century, with facades and interiors updated to match contemporary styles. This would explain the uniformity, not as coordination but as constraint. Builders worked within existing parameters. This interpretation has less archival support, but it's not without precedent. Churches, forts, and civic buildings were often rebuilt on older sites using remnant infrastructure. Whether that applies to asylums and prisons remains debated. The third, inherited infrastructure. This is the interpretation most associated with the Tartaria framework. It suggests that some institutional buildings, canal systems, and rail corridors were not built by the 19th century societies that occupied them, but were inherited, either from an earlier phase of development or from a prior civilization whose records were incomplete, lost, or rewritten. Under this view, the simultaneity and over-engineering aren't anomalies. They're evidence of a pre-existing system being repurposed. This interpretation is the most speculative. It requires assumptions not currently supported by mainstream scholarship. But it attempts to answer a question the other frameworks leave open. Why so much, so fast, so uniform? All 3 interpretations acknowledge the same underlying observation. Between 1816 and 1870, institutional infrastructure appeared at a scale and speed that feels compressed. The mechanisms behind that compression are where the disagreement lies. There's one other detail worth returning to. 1816 is sometimes called the year without a summer. A volcanic eruption in Indonesia, Mount Tambora, released enough ash into the atmosphere to alter global climate patterns. Crops failed. Famine spread. Populations migrated. In the years immediately following, construction boomed. Not just reconstruction, new construction. Canals, asylums, prisons, hospitals. Some interpret this as a response to crisis. Governments invested in infrastructure to stabilize society and stimulate economies. Others see it differently. They point to the buildings themselves, structures that seem too advanced, too coordinated, too large for a society recovering from catastrophe. Unless the catastrophe itself had cleared the way for something already there. This is where interpretation becomes metaphor. Tartaria isn't necessarily a literal claim about a lost empire. For some, it's a way of asking, what if the infrastructure we attribute to progress was actually continuity? What if 19th century institutions didn't invent the systems they occupied, but formalized them? The label creates space for the question. It doesn't provide the answer. The floor plans remain. The buildings remain. The records, construction dates, architect names, municipal budgets, remain. None of it is hidden. But the pattern, when seen in aggregate, resists easy explanation. Institutional architecture didn't evolve slowly, region by region, over generations. It appeared rapidly, uniformly, at a scale beyond immediate need. Whether that reflects coordination, inheritance, or something else entirely depends on which framework you apply. The evidence invites examination. The story allows for multiple conclusions. And the buildings, silent, symmetrical, still standing, offer no final answers. Only the questions they were designed to hold.